Okay, welcome to session 16, part B. Okay, I'm going to start off this part discussing an aspect, a notion that the book talks about coercion. Okay, what does coercion mean? When someone forces you to do something. Okay, physically forces you. It's not persuasion. Some people will say coerce me by paying me a price I couldn't refuse. Economists don't call that coercion. Coercion means where you have a gun or you use physical force, somehow your fists, and you force someone to do something. Um, we say that maybe the main thing that government does is it has the power of coercion, and usually it has a monopoly on coercion. If anyone else does it, it's against the law. If the government does it, it's fine. Or it's often part of the law that is actually prescribed by the government. Now, what do I mean by that? So some people say, "Oh, no, 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 the government doesn't force you to do things." So, an example. Lots of us, we live in the state of Virginia. We have to get a little safety inspection sticker on our car. Or get a safety inspection every year or every 2 years and get the little sticker on our car. And a key thing is government forces us to do that. You can say, no, 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 government doesn't force you. If you don't do it, all that happens is a cop will stop you and give you a ticket, and all you have to do is pay a fine. The government isn't forcing you, it's just making you pay a fine. So, well, wait, wait, wait. What if I refuse to get the safety inspection? Cop stops me, cop gives me a ticket, and I say, no, I'm not going to pay that ticket. Well, usually I get another ticket or somehow, here's a summons to appear in court. What if I say, no, I'm not going to appear in court. I'm not going to pay that extra ticket. You keep going down this line. Eventually, with the government, in this case, the state government of Virginia, will say, no, we'll arrest you and we'll put you in jail. And this is by force. Cops will put handcuffs on me and drag me to jail against my will. And that's the point. Even though it may start off with just a fine, the key thing that is backed up by force. And that's what I mean by government can force you to do certain things. You could say, well, you don't have to drive a car, but the point is, so given that I'm driving a car, the government is forcing me to get a safety inspection. Okay, so that's what I mean by coercion, and what I mean by the key thing that government does is it coerces people. Okay. Um, Now, the book also talks a couple paragraphs about saying, well, normally we think of coercion as bad, but in some ways we may think maybe not. I mean, there's certain things we may like from government, in that it'd be impossible to achieve these things without coercion. So the key is to think about, maybe what's the right amount of coercion. Not that we want zero. Now, before I go into that further, uh, I am partially sympathetic. There's kind of a radical libertarian argument. There are some people who say they're kind of like how pacifists say I'm never in favor of violence in any case. Well, there's some radical libertarians who will say I don't think anyone should ever have the right to coerce anyone, not governments, not anyone. Okay. Um, I'm partially sympathetic to that view, but let me explain why I'm not completely sympathetic with that. I think there's some cases where you can have a group where the group will unanimously prefer some coercion. Okay, and here's one of the classic examples economists sometimes talk about, and I don't know the actual story, and I don't know if I'm getting the details right. Maybe it's just a myth. Whether it's a myth or not, it illustrates a point. So even if it's not true, assume for the moment that it's true. It helps illustrate a point I'm trying to make. So the story goes: in ancient China, there was some of these businesses where, for some reason, there would be this river, and boats could easily go downstream in the river, and then somehow um, transport these goods. They've got to get the boat back up the river. How do they do that? Well, this is the boat, And what they would do is they'd hire these workers to attach ropes to the boat, and then there are these workers that are each one is pulling the boat. And so there's three ropes on the other side. That all big team of workers will pull the boat back upstream. Okay. Now, according to the story, th- in this business, or in these businesses, these workers, there would be another worker who would be standing by the rope pullers. There would be someone with a whip who would, if they saw anyone shirking, not doing their part, their fair part to pull the rope, they'd get whipped. Okay, you think, wait, this seems cruel, but it turns out the workers did this voluntarily. They agreed to work for this company. And so the story goes the workers actually preferred the guy to have a whip, because if there wasn't a guy with a whip, their fellow workers would shirk. And so if this guy is doing his fair share and pulling really hard, working really hard, and the other two are not, it's I don't like this at all. I want the other two guys to get whipped. And you could imagine a situation where all these three, it's like three other workers, the all six would say, yeah, so that all of us contributes the fair share. It's good to have someone whipping. Now, I hope that no one ends up getting whipped. Everyone instead does their fair share, and the whipper never has to pull out his whip. Um, but you could imagine that situation where people could voluntarily and actually unanimously want someone to be there who could exert coercion, okay, like that person doing the whip. It's a similar story with sometimes in war. So you have a regiment, and there's sometimes someone a soldier in back of the regiment whose job is to kill anyone who tries to flee. And you think, wait, that is so cruel. Why, if I was one of those soldiers, I wouldn't want that guy who has the machine gun who could kill me if I flee. On the other hand, you might. If you think if you're in that regiment and you're one of the guys, you think, well, this will help us win if we can make sure no one flees. So I'm all in favor of having someone in the back of us who will shoot a machine gun at any one of us that flees. And it could be that all the soldiers in that regiment could prefer such a situation where they want a guy with a machine gun like that, someone who has the power of coercion. Okay, so there may be some cases, and where people actually unanimously would want government coercion for some situation. Okay, so this would be a private group, the one with the Chinese workers, as I said. But another situation is where a policy where I think there's something like unanimity. So we could argue whether this is 100% true or not, but I think it's close to being true. It's something like at least a minimal military force. If we have something like unanimity for at least a minimal force, we don't want the Canadians invaded taking over our country or the Russians invading. We want at least a small force. And I think there's something like it's pretty close to we would unanimously agree on that. I would bet it's at least 95% and probably something like 99.9%. Now, given that we all want at least a small military, it might not work to have this being done voluntarily. So you'd probably have very few people willing to donate much time to go out and stand on the borders to try to be the defense for a possible invasion. But instead, what we could do is say, well, let's have a small tax. We tax everyone, and this tax will pay soldiers to be our defense. And you could imagine a situation where we, Americans, unanimously prefer to have this small tax, at least a small tax, to have this military. And I think this is even though I'm partially sympathetic with that radical libertarian view of no coercion, I think one place where it breaks down is you can have these situations where you have unanimity or near unanimity in favor of coercion for some government policy. And I think that military is potentially a case. Um, okay, so that is um, okay. The first point, what we mean by coercion, why sometimes we unanimously might prefer at least some policies where government has the power for coercion. Um, uh, let's see. Now, another the next point that I want to talk about. Um, could we get um, these government policies that we often depend on just from voluntary cooperation, just by volunteerism? Sometimes we can, but a lot of times we can't. And I think here would be an example. Suppose that if we talk about all the roads in Fairfax County, okay, um, uh, you could get in the olden days. You had like some people who would voluntarily help set up a road. Um, you might get a few roads that were set up voluntarily, but I don't think near the amount that all of us would prefer. I think here's another case for something like we almost unanimously prefer to have some sort of government to set up the roads. And so even though volunteerism might provide some roads, it wouldn't provide the efficient amount. If we whatever we had by volunteerism, I think we would say there's another case that we could all become better off if we could have just a little bit, at least a little bit of coercion from government. Um, okay, so that's second point. Um, um, okay, next I'm going to talk in a second about the free rider problem. Um, Now, um, before I talk about that, I want to talk about another notion called excludability. Excludability. And often we talk about how this is related to public goods. Okay. Public goods, they're very similar to a positive externality. Now, excludability, okay, that means if you provide some good, is there a way to exclude people? Okay, now the normal economic good, that's true. So a car manufacturer, they produce a car, they sell it to the one driver, the one owner of the car, and no one else can use it. Assuming no one else can steal it and they don't have the key. It's easy to exclude other people from using that one car. There's other things like parks. So we say sometimes the parks are a public good. Now, it's very hard. So you could have private parks, okay, um, and if you do something like a country club, you set up a fence around it, and you say you have to pay to get in, and we can exclude people. Okay. Uh, Sometimes we say though the transactions costs are kind of high. It costs something to put up a fence. Sometimes the transaction costs are so high that maybe it's better if the government just pays for it and we allow anyone who wants to use the park. Okay. So when we do that and we don't have the fence up, we say it's pretty close to impossible to exclude people. This is a case of the good is non-excludable, very different from a car. And maybe the best example of something that's non-excludable would be military protection. And so the idea is that if you think about, suppose we had a private military, and so you had to pay. There's a military that's going to pay to keep the Russians from invading the U.S. Um, Now, suppose that um, my wife is in favor of that. She pays, okay, but I don't. Now, what happens when the Russians invade? It's going to be very hard for this private military to tell the Russians, hey, look, protect Tim's wife who paid for the military, but don't protect Tim, okay? Even though my wife and I live in the same house, it's very hard for that military to do such a thing. So often we say military protection. It's very hard to exclude people who say are not willing to pay for it. And that's one aspect of a public good. And we often say with public goods, there's room for government to provide them. Um, okay. Um, so another aspect of public goods and excludability, mainly with public goods, or um, even more than just public goods, more in general, there's something called the free rider problem. And that's if a lot of us want something, um, um, that something may benefit a lot of people. You'd say, well, let's all donate to that. But there's always an incentive for some people to say, if you can't exclude, those people will say, well, I still get the benefits of that good. Why donate? Okay. When that happens, we call that a free rider problem. So, uh, to continue with this example, so the military, suppose instead of uh, having a government provide military service, instead we had a private military, and everyone was supposed to pay or donate to have this military, to have our defense services. Well, what could happen is that some people would pay, but there'd be lots of people who say, because it's non-excludable, okay, the military can't tell the Russians, go ahead and capture Tim, but not his wife. Um, because of that problem, there could be lots of people who would say, well, no, I'm not going to donate money to the military. I'm going to allow everyone else to pay for it. And that would be called a free rider problem. The people who don't pay would be the free riders. Um, okay. And then let's see. So the final thing, though, and the book discusses this. It said, well, look, you get a free rider problem if people are selfish. And a key aspect of that is you don't need people to be totally selfish to have a free rider problem, as long as people are partially selfish. And here's what I mean by that. So, um, um, I'm a person, I would consider myself selfish, but also sometimes not so selfish. So I donate to charity. Sometimes I donate my time. But on the other hand, I don't donate all my money to charity. I don't donate all my money. I am interested in the public good, but I don't donate all my money and all my time toward the public good. Where if I were totally selfless, I would say there's 300 million people in the U.S. and here's my salary. I'm going to keep 1/300 millionth, this very, very tiny fraction that for me, I'm so public spirited, I'll give the rest to everyone else. I don't do that. Okay. So I'm not totally selfless. Okay. Nor am I totally selfish because I give some money to charity. I'm in between. But even if someone like me, who is only partially selfish, you can still get the free rider problem. Okay, that's a key point that the book makes. Um, and when this happens, sometimes there will be room for government coercion for certain goods that we may or certain government policies that we may want. Okay, so I'm going to end there. Next, I'm going to talk about Part C, some particular government programs and how they're related to externalities, free rider problems, and so on. Okay, so that's Part B. See you in Part C.